Good evening, everyone. I believe we are, in fact, currently live. It is showing we are live. That is a good thing. So, we are back in Revelation. One thing I wanted to do this evening was hopefully, I tried to create a flow chart of Revelation so far. It just really didn't work, so I kind of did a number with a bullet point thing, and I'll put that up here in a minute. But again, Revelation was written to the 7 churches there in Asia, and it was to give them hope and reassurance, and for them to stay faithful, and especially for them to stay faithful. And what the problem is with Revelation for most people was the imagery. They get sidetracked, they run down a rabbit hole. And so I'm going to actually, we will pick up this evening where we left off last week. But I do want to run down this basically flow of what we've been looking at and reading so far. The first part is, it starts off, and I should have these on the PowerPoint, Karen. There we go. First of all, it starts out with a greeting and then the letter to the 7 churches. He was giving them warnings and promises. He was saying, hey, y'all, some of you are doing good. Some of you are not doing so good. Fix this. Stay faithful. There's going to be persecution. Then John goes up to heaven to the throne room, and there's a whole bunch of imagery about what's going on there. We see the Lamb there, we see the elders there, we see other people there, we see worship going on there. We see one of the first big things we see there is the Lamb opens the scrolls, which is basically contains the judgment. We see the 4 horsemen there, the sealing of the 144,000, which of course is representative of the saved. And once that, we have the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, and God is basically saying, these are the judgments. This is all right, time's up. These are the judgments. Then we have the 2 witnesses, where they witness for 1,260 days, or the perfect amount of time. And then we have, we're next introduced to the woman and the dragon. Satan's he wants to basically stop the birth of the Messiah. Then he wants to kill the Messiah. Doesn't work. The woman flees, and God protects them. And then the war breaks out in heaven. Satan's defeated and cast down to earth. And the war breaks out down here. Last week we saw where Satan raised up 2 beasts, one from the sea, one from the earth. And we talked about those and who they represent, political groups, and it's a spiritual and a physical. And then the last thing we talked about last week, the Lamb comes on the scene with the 144,000. And the battle is set to begin here on earth. And that's where we left off last week. Now we read, I think, 5 verses last week in chapter 14. So I'm just going to read those real quick to refresh, and then we'll move on into the new material. We start out in chapter 14, verse 1. It says, "Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads." I'm going to pause for a moment. Chapter 13 was the beast, and the mark of the beast, and how they raised up, and Satan raised up a beast. And it said in there that he looked like the Son of Man, but he wasn't, obviously. And we know here, it says, "Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb." So we know who we're talking about here. And it goes on in verse 2 and says, "And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters, and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one on earth could learn the song except for the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. And it says, these are those who did not defile themselves with woman, for they remain virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as first fruits to God as the Lamb. No lie was found among their mouths. They were blameless. Who are they talking about again here with the 144,000? They're talking about the saved. Why couldn't the people on earth learn the song? Because it was salvation, is what it's representing. And of course, they weren't talking about physical sexual virgins. They were talking about people that were cleansed, were found to be without sin. So, here we go. There's Jesus, 144,000 on Mount Zion. Boom. Now we come into verse 6. And it said, John says, then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. A second angel followed and said, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its images and receives its mark on their forehead or on their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which he has poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, or for anyone who receives the mark of its name. Okay, so now we've been introduced to three angels. The first one's delivering the message, the everlasting gospel, given for our benefit and all people. The second one is talking about the falling of the apostate Babylon, which is not the physical city of Babylon. It's the spiritually lost in some ways, you could say. Also, many point towards physically Rome. The third angel, of course, warns of the consequences of having the mark of the beast. There you go. Now, a couple months ago, those of y'all who know who Kirk Cameron is, he came out talking about he's an annihilationist. He believes that, you're sent to hell for a little while, then you no longer exist. There are a lot of things you have to be careful. I've talked about this many times. We have to take everything into context, not just a few verses. And you can pluck some verses out that say, oh, yep, see here, they'll no longer exist after a period of time. But that doesn't take into account the full gospel, the full context. We have here in verses 10 and 11, we actually have a description of what hell is like in some ways, and what will happen to the people who die lost. It starts out and says they will drink from the wine of the wrath of God. So they're going to be punished. They're also going to suffer punishment that is unmixed. In other words, it's not tempered. I've talked about tempered enough. I think we all got a good idea of that. They'll experience torment with fire and brimstone, suffer in the presence of the Lamb and the holy angels, and suffer unending torment. Now, Yeah, not good. We can go into that more in depth, but none of us want it. None of us want it. Unending torment. There you go. Now, verses 12 and 13 really underscore one of the main themes of the whole book of Revelation. So chapter 14, verse 12 says, he was just talking about the punishment and everything. So he's telling the people he's writing it to, this calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. Patient endurance in what? Remember, they have been told that they will be persecuted. So that's what they are enduring. And then verse 13 says, then I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. Okay, let's think about these two verses. The whole book is basically to give them encouragement to remain faithful and to, sorry, I got a little fellow waving at me. Hey, Elliot, Oliver. I do that all the time. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. See, I am very easily distracted. Verse 12 again. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. This whole book is about them remaining faithful. They need to remain faithful. And they need to endure whatever it is they individually have to endure. You can wrap up this whole book of Revelation right here with this. Then we see in verse 13, it says, I heard a voice from heaven say, write this. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. In other words, basically saying you will be rewarded. What was he just talking about in verse 12? The torment. The people that are going to be punished. So you have two groups, the sheep and the goats, but also basically you can say the saved and the not saved. The ones that go to heaven, the ones that remain in torment for eternity in hell. All right, woof, there's that. Now we have a little bit of a change. This is verse 14 in chapter 14. John says, I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who's sitting on the cloud, take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Earth was harvested. Referencing the faithful. First of all, taking the faithful home, if you will. We've read in other places in the book, the Bible, how Jesus will come back on what? In the what? Not everybody at once. The clouds. Yes, the air, the clouds. Remember, this was a guy, Jesus, he was seated on a cloud, and he was coming back. Then we see in verse 17, says, another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another, who had charge of the fire, came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sharp sickle and gather the cluster of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. He's talking about the unfaithful here, being thrown into the winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia, which is roughly 180 miles, excuse me. Some say 180, some say 184. It's right in there, give or take a few miles. Other words, does it matter if it's 180 or 184? The whole book of Revelation should be telling you by now, no, it doesn't. What does it mean? It means a whole lot of blood, a whole lot of people being punished. By the way, if you ever want to look at something that's kind of interesting, look back in the Old Testament, all the way through the Bible, about winepress. It's actually a pretty neat study. Okay, let's see here. There were actually, if you notice, there were two separate harvests. Did we not see that? We had the harvest of the grapes, and then Jesus harvesting as well. Sheep, goats, with the goats or the grapes being thrown into the winepress, and they were being punished. One other thing. Y'all notice something here? There is not a single mention anywhere here of 1,000 years. Is there? Nope. There's nothing that says Jesus comes back and takes away the good and then waits for 1,000 years to come back, or stays on earth as, which we know he actually doesn't physically come all the way to terra firma, and then rule for 1,000 years on a physical throne here on earth. That's all dispensational premillennialists teaching. And again, I'm not a person that bashes. They understand incorrectly because they have been taught incorrectly, but they also talk about this being a 1,000-year portion right here, but it never says anything about that. All right, now, we actually start a little different series here. And starting in chapter 15 and going through 20, there's a lot of God's wrath in these chapters, to be honest with you. We see the number 7 again associated throughout this, and it's associated with completeness. And I talk about not running down a rabbit hole. Why is all of this here? Could not have God just said, we're going to have this, there is going to be a battle. I win. Period. The faithful are brought to heaven. The others are taken to hell and suffer eternal punishment. There's something to be said also about comfort for the people that were reading this. What would be more comfortable, that statement or all of this wild imagery about how evil is defeated? It gives them something to focus on. The evil is defeated by all of this imagery. It helps them have something while they are being persecuted to remember. There's also other people that say a lot of Revelation was written in code to keep people of the time from getting in trouble for having it. Is that a possibility? Yes, certainly. Could all of this be just code for what's really going on? Yes. There you go. Now we're going to jump into those 5 chapters that really reflect a lot of the actual punishment. And we see and start in verse 15. Wish you have time to finish this chapter tonight. It says, John says, I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign. 7 angels with the 7 last plagues last, because with them God's wrath is complete. And I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who had been victorious over the beast and its image and over the number of its name. They held harps given them by God and sang the song of God's servant Moses and of the Lamb. And I quote, "Great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you. For your righteous acts have been revealed." Song of the Saints, victory. Again, you look at the words there and what it says. It's a reminder of who God is and his victories. I read that kind of slow, but I'm going to read it one more time. But man, it says, "Great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of nations." Boy, wouldn't the people on this earth, don't the people on this earth clamor for leadership that is just and true? Then it goes on in verse 4 and says, "Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All the nations will come and worship you. For your righteous acts have been revealed." What are we going to say on the day that we get to heaven? If it's heaven first, or at that point, or we go to paradise. I mean, we're just going to be blown away. Wouldn't we be doing the same thing, going, man, it blows my mind how incredible God is. I don't think our human mind here can conceive it personally. Then we pick up in verse 5 of chapter 15, and it says, "After this I looked, and I saw in heaven the temple, that is, the tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was opened. Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen, and wore golden sashes around their chests. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke and the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were complete." Now, the beginning of God's wrath on the wicked is where we'll pick up next week in chapter 16. I thought about this week when I was reading this, and I wonder how some of the things that we may find incredible. But we have here, it says in verse 6, "Out of the temple came 7 angels, 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen, and wore golden sashes around their chests." I bet we ain't never seen anything close to what that's going to look like. It says clean linen. How are that? Shining linen. How are we going to understand what they really look like? They have to explain it to us in what we can understand. God has to use the language that we can understand for us to understand it. All of this going on, my belief is, this is my belief, but when we get to paradise, we're going to be awestruck. Really. We're going to be completely and utterly dumbfounded of how incredible it really is. And this is what God, through John, is trying to get across to us. Pearly gates, crystal sea, all of this imagery, streets of gold. We're just going to be awestruck when we get to heaven. I hope y'all know that. I hope you realize that. We're not going to get there and be like walking in the doors here and be like, yeah, I've seen all this before. It ain't going to be that way, y'all. It's going to be utterly beyond words. Have you ever heard, I just thought about this. There was cartoons on Saturday morning growing up. There was this dog on one of them. It was a bigger, lanky type dog. And the dog would be surprised or something and his jaw would literally hit the ground. I kind of image like us, going and getting there and just be someone walking up going, bloop, closing her mouth. That's what we have to look forward to, y'all. What an incredible thing. And so far, through the book of Revelation, we have seen where God started out by going, hey, y'all, some of you are doing really good in this part. Some of you not so good in this part. Keep doing what you should be doing and what you're doing good at. Stop doing what you're bad at and remain faithful. Remain faithful. Because then John goes to heaven and he goes through and he sees everything going on. The Lamb opening up the scroll, and then we have the lampstands, and we've got the trumpets and the angels and the elders and everything going on. This is all giving reassurance to the people reading this. Someone has seen it. It's real. This is what's going on. And God, throughout the first part there, we see the judgments that are to come. Then we see the conflict in the beginning with the devil, Satan, and where he is defeated and thrown to earth. And then we see the devil, Satan, here on earth, raising up evil powers, in essence. They're called beasts here in chapter 13. And then we see the Lamb, the opposing force. We have the evil force. Then we have the opposing force, which is the Lamb, the Son of Man, and those that have been saved. And now we see the harvest. We see the harvest of the faithful, where they are harvested and taken to heaven, and the harvest of the unfaithful, where they are put into the winepress and tormented or crushed, literally, as it says, their blood spilled. So that's where we are so far. We'll pick up again next week in chapter 16. Thank you all for being with us this evening. I hope you have a good evening. If you'd like any notes from the lessons, please let me know. I'll be glad to share those with you. And I'm going to try to figure out a better way to show a flow chart, if you will, of the book of Revelation, what happens, to help. I'm a visual learner a lot of times. And I know there has to be some others here that may help as well. But thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Take care.